What is going on, everyone? Welcome to another very exciting episode right here on the MIgardener channel. In today's episode, I'm going to be sharing with you 5 mistakes that I don't want to see you making when growing the king of the garden, the tomato. All right, so the first mistake when growing tomatoes, and I think this is a really common one, has to do with infrequent watering. You see, if you let your tomato plants dry out and then you water them, or if it rains, you can really easily get what's called cracking. Now, this tomato right here is experiencing some cracking, and it's really no fault of my own, other than the fact that when the tomato was ripening, the skin of the tomato hardens up, and it essentially tells itself, I'm done getting any larger. The problem is, if it gets water right before that blushing process happens, it can't really get any larger. The skin really loses that elasticity. So a tomato that's green has a lot more elasticity that if it gets in water, it gets it really fast, it'll actually expand. But once that blushing process starts, the tomato has basically said, I'm not gonna get any larger. And that's where you can start to get some of the cracking on the shoulders. So what you can do to prevent this is by making sure that you water on a regular schedule. I typically make sure that my plants are watered at least 2 inches down at all times. They never really get more dry than that. And that ensures that any cracking doesn't really happen. And if they do happen to get a surprise rain, the rain is not necessarily going to be so much that it causes cracking. Now, some varieties are more prone to cracking than others. You can certainly find some varieties that are crack resistant, but some of these more heirloom varieties, they're just kind of sensitive to it. And we just had a lot of rain over the past couple of days. And even though we water pretty frequently, sometimes it's just a little too much rain for them. So sometimes you can prevent it, sometimes you can't. But that's definitely the first mistake, is infrequent watering. All right, the second most common mistake I see a lot of gardeners making when growing tomatoes is not pruning your tomato plants up. So when it comes to pruning your tomato plants, there's a couple reasons why you want to do it. And it's really important that we do it as gardeners, because regardless of how you're growing your tomato plants, whether they're in a cage, up a stake, or on some type of trellis system, pruning your tomato plants does a few things that all gardeners can benefit from. The first thing is it opens up airflow. You see, tomatoes are really prone to what's called blight. And blight is a soil-borne fungus that when splashed on the leaves, it actually can colonize the leaf and start to move up the plant and eventually can kill the plant. So we want to, as gardeners, prevent that as much as possible. By pruning the plants up, we're going to reduce the chance that dirt is going to splash from the soil onto the leaves. When we water or it rains, it's really going to cut down on that. Now, the second thing it does is it actually allows the fruit to ripen faster, because when the fruit is exposed to more sunlight, it's going to help that fruit to ripen faster. So if you're in a cooler climate, or you're someone that's really struggling to ripen up your fruit, having your plant really opened up down there is going to help your fruit ripen. And the third reason why you want to prune is it opens up sunlight for more plants to be grown. Now, as gardeners, we want to maximize our garden space. We want to get more plants in a smaller area. And so here we have some beets growing in and around our tomato plants. We have beans as well, some squash. There's lots of different plants you can interplant. You could even plant things like herbs, right? Basil is a wonderful one. And it allows us to grow plants around our tomato plants rather than just having one giant tomato plant crowding out all that space and creating a bunch of shade. So 3 reasons to prune up your tomato plant. Now, I've got a couple here that could use a little bit of maintenance. So coming in close, I'll show you how we prune these up. That way they stay dry, they could get airflow, the fruit ripens up, and allow sunlight to come into these plants that are planted below them. All right, so this plant right here needs to be pruned up. As you can see, we're getting some dirt splashing up on the leaves. This is definitely way too low to the soil. I like to, on a plant of this size, have at least a foot where there's no foliage. And so coming in here, we have the main stem, because we're single stemming, but even if you're allowing your plant to grow like a bush in a cage, you can still prune your plants, because we have the main growth stem up here, and then off of the growth stem, we have lateral growth. And that lateral growth is just our leaf nodes that allow the leaves to come out from the center of the plant. And all we're doing is we're just pruning them up, like I said, about a foot. I want to make sure that I have a good amount of just stem, and fruit is fine, but no foliage. If the foliage starts touching the ground, it's really a recipe for disease and a lot of other problems that can happen. So just coming in here, pruning this up, and also just kind of anytime you see any disease or anything like that, like this one here had some little bits of leaf spot and stuff like that, some very early signs of early blight. Even though we've been pruning, sometimes it's nice to come in here and just kind of constantly prune your plant up, keep your plant really healthy, especially going into later months of summer. The third mistake I see a lot of gardeners making when growing tomatoes is not using pruners to harvest their tomatoes. Now, when it comes to harvesting your tomatoes, the reason why you want to use pruners is because of this exact example. You see, this tomato right here has what's known as a knuckle. The knuckle has been basically bred into tomatoes to allow for easier harvesting. Certain heirloom varieties, though, don't have any knuckle at all. Knuckle, just like on your finger, is just a joint in between the bud and the tomato stem, the truss of the tomato. This tomato does not have a knuckle, and so what happens when you go to harvest it is it breaks. And when it breaks, you end up exposing a lot of that tomato flesh that's going to rot. It dramatically decreases the shelf life of your tomato from about 4 to 5 days down to about a day before you start to get mold. All right, so in the case of these tomatoes here, now these are all ripe and beautiful. I can harvest all 3 at the same time, which is a little bit rare with heirloom tomatoes. But coming over here, I've got this beautiful, absolutely gorgeous Jubilee tomato, and it does not have a knuckle that I can really break freely. So a simple snip allows me to harvest that tomato, still while keeping this flower bud attached to the top of the tomato. And that makes sure that the lifespan of the tomato, the shelf life, is going to be retained on the counter, rather than going to rot way too fast. Now, the fourth mistake I know a lot of you make, because I see your emails, so you can't get away from this one. This is definitely a mistake that a lot of you are making, and that is fertilizing too much. Now, when it comes to your tomato plants, we just did a video about how over-fertilizing your plants actually can decrease yields. And the reason why that happens is because your tomato plants only produce fruit when they are incentivized to do so. And generally that incentive is actually a threat of them dying, believe it or not. When you're fertilizing your plants and you're always pumping them full of lots of nitrogen, the plants are going to be super green and they're going to be very healthy, but they're not going to be encouraged to produce fruit, because the fruit is actually what contains the seeds of future tomato plants. And so if that tomato plant has no threat of dying, there's no incentive to produce these beautiful fruits. And that's what we want as gardeners. So what you can do is basically decrease the fertilizing. Come about the first week in July, end of June or so, cutting that fertilizer back by about 80% or entirely if you feel like doing that, can actually incentivize the plant to use what's in the soil and actually start producing some fruit for you. All right, the fifth and final mistake that a lot of gardeners make, and this one is a little bit subjective, is not growing enough variety. When it comes to heirloom tomatoes, variety is the spice of life. There are so many varieties that exist. In fact, believe it or not, there's over 3,000 varieties of heirloom tomatoes that exist to us as gardeners. And so whether you're growing these beautiful, long, federally paste tomatoes, or the giant yellow Jubilees, low acid and sweet as heck, or whether you're growing the giant crimson, which is one we brought back from extinction, there's so many that exist, and there's so many shapes, sizes, colors, great unique traits that are available to us as gardeners that you should be experiencing. The other reason why growing more than one variety in your garden is beneficial is because the season is always changing, and some varieties of tomatoes have different traits that allow them to handle those differences. For instance, there's some drought-tolerant varieties of tomato, like the Rio Grande, that does really well in dry conditions, but another variety, like for instance the Ace 55, would really suffer in those same dry conditions. But if it happens to be rainier than normal, like it's been rainier than normal this season, there's some varieties that are more crack resistant than other varieties, right? So by growing more than one variety, it's going to allow you to not only experience more diversity, which is always great, but it's also going to allow you to have more chances of success in the garden if something goes wrong or things don't happen according to plan, which, let's face it, as gardeners, nothing ever goes according to plan. So I hope you guys enjoyed. I hope you all learned something new. If you did, make sure to hit the like button, subscribe if you haven't already, and try growing tomatoes. If you haven't already, they're one of the most rewarding, beautiful, and flavorful crops in the garden. All right, take care, everyone. And as always, this is Luke from the MIgardener channel, reminding you to grow bigger. See ya. Bye. Jeez, what the frick? What?